Have you ever been watching someone play Minecraft and they whip up the most beautiful creations you've ever seen seemingly out of nowhere? Do your builds, on the other hand, tend to look like they were made by a 6-year-old who's never played the game before? Or maybe, despite your best efforts, your builds always end up looking straight out of the Great Depression. Well, this video is for you. Today I'm going to show you how to level up your design and creation skills in Minecraft with 10 simple tips that you can apply to almost any type of build to turn it from bland and basic to truly unique.
Having an idea and planning it out is key. But if you have no idea what you want to build, you're obviously not going to get anywhere. Of course, you need to pick somewhere to build first of all. While it might be easy, don't just go to a flat spot of grass. I'm not saying you can never do that, but picking a challenging spot to build not only hones your skills, but makes the final product that much more interesting. If we look for somewhere maybe in this hill, or if we go to this forest over here, obviously it's going to be a lot more challenging to figure out how to build in this area. But maybe if we were to use this little platform here, take out these trees, we could build something that in the end is going to be a lot more interesting to look at. Don't be afraid to get started. If you need to, you can always change things later, and picking a more challenging area to build is going to improve your skills in the future. And of course, one of the most important parts of planning is this may be one of the most important tips that I can offer. I see so many people that just build a square or a rectangle and call it a day, but varying the shape of the building will instantly level up the quality of your build. I made a little example over here. I used these colored blocks to sort of illustrate it. You don't have to just make completely random shapes. You can work with rectangles and squares, but if you interlay them into each other, and then you just come down and knock out these parts, then you've got a much more interesting shape to build from. And in the end, it's going to end up looking a lot more complex and interesting. Just think about what a real building looks like. Rarely are they just flat and four-sided. There are rooms, closets, balconies, and garages that jut out of the building or make different shapes splitting off of it. So when you put down the foundation of your building, create a unique and varied shape. It may be more challenging to work on compared to just a rectangle, but finding solutions to finish the building will not only make your build more impressive, but it'll make you that much better as a builder. Space is another important thing to consider when you're building. One of the biggest things that hurts people's builds is not having enough space. Many people just build 2 blocks up and put the roof right over their head. While that's technically all you need, you can tell that it feels very cramped and there's no space to move around. And you rob yourself of so much opportunity. If you raise the roof just a little bit, like even with this same simple box, putting the roof just a little bit higher allows you to do so much more. You can add details to the roof with lighting, patterns, and trim. There's no hard rule about this, and of course it depends on the feel you're wanting to create, but generally I leave 3 or 4 blocks above my head at minimum. And don't just think about the roof, because space matters in every dimension. You don't want to end up with an awkwardly cramped hallway. Even though the roof is high enough, there's not enough space on the sides for it to feel comfortable. Make sure there's always enough space to move around comfortably. Also with the floor, you don't want a floor that's irregular and all of a sudden goes up, because that'll smush you into the roof or the lighting that you have. So make sure to keep your space open and comfortable and consistent, unless you're going for a certain uncomfortable feel, I suppose. Also, don't forget about the outside. Space matters there too. If you build a tiny house in a huge cavern, it's going to look pretty weird. And it would also be a problem if you tried to build a 5-story mansion on this tiny little peak right here. The more proportionate you can make your build look to its surroundings, the more natural it's going to feel. When it comes to creating visually appealing builds, it's all about balance. Some of you may know this as a common tip in art, but it applies here as well. You might think that just means symmetry, like with this house here, but it really doesn't. In my opinion, purely symmetrical builds, especially houses, are pretty boring. You can have a balanced creation without necessarily having symmetry. Essentially, the idea here is that having lots of items, colors, or textures in one area of the build creates a visual weight. Think about it like a seesaw. In order to level out the seesaw, you're going to need to balance the weight on one side by putting items or details of similar weight on the other. This keeps the build from looking unfinished, broken, or lopsided. You can see I've done this here with this house. This one side is farther back, so it looks smaller, and the other side is closer, which gives it more visual weight. So the bigger area of the house over here, I've balanced out with a tree, and I made the path go towards the left side as well in order to help balance out the weight. And you can tell, even though it's not symmetrical, it looks nice and balanced and complete. Going along with the last tip, you need to create depth as well. Maybe you've built a simple little house like this before. It's not very impressive, is it? That's because there's nothing to draw the eye. Almost everything is just a flat surface with two different colors, the stone and the wood. Without even having to change the materials that we're using, let's go ahead and add some depth. One of my favorite ways to do this is to use glass panes instead of blocks. It's a simple and easy step, but right away, with that layer of depth, you can already tell that the house is looking better. Next, let's give the roof an overhang and maybe a chimney. Aligning the door with the interior side of the block will also bring more variation to the build. To create even more depth, it's important to layer. Play around with pillars, windowsills, window shades, and trim. It's looking a lot more impressive already, but I think we can do better, which brings me to the next tip. Without some smaller items, the build is still kind of falling flat. Let's fix that by adding some details. Instead of torches, I usually like to add lanterns. I'll hang them from stairs or from the roof's overhang. We can also add some little planter boxes with flowers or shrubs and surround them with trapdoors to create a little planter box effect. Maybe we'll use some slabs and buttons as rocks. We can add a path, place some fences along it, and we'll throw in some trees and grass for good measure. On the roof, we can swap out some stairs for some blocks to break up the uniformity and create more texture. Inside the house, we'll put some detail around the bed, maybe by adding a nightstand here. We can use a block with a button, and then put a little flower on top of it. We can hang a painting next to the bed as well, and we'll put down a simple rug. Instead of just an ugly row of function blocks against the wall, let's integrate them into our kitchen space. A cauldron with a tripwire hook will make a great sink. We can also add a counter and put a furnace next to it. I like to add a stair above the furnace as a fume hood and a train track as a cooking hook. For the crafting table, we can make a little workshop corner over here. I like to make a bench with a slab, and then we'll put the crafting table over here and a place for our brewing stand. We'll also put some barrels up above for storage, and this little corner is also a good place to add a grindstone, a cartography table, or whatever else you might want. We can also spruce up the rest of the house with a little table and a chair, maybe some candles. We can add some bookshelves as well, and then a painting over here. You'll also notice I added a fireplace for some more detail and to help light up the house. I had to keep repositioning it quite a bit, but that's totally fine. That's one of the ways that you figure out what works with the build and what doesn't. So if you just kind of reworking some areas, it'll give you a better idea of what you want your finished build to be. And that's just about it for the detailing. And now look at how much there is to look at compared to before. The details in the house keep drawing your eye around the room, and it makes it feel a lot more cozy than just a plain wooden box. It may seem like a small detail, but if you don't have texture, your builds will be much less interesting. This is one of the most common mistakes that I think people make. It's just that they don't have enough variation in their blocks, and it's just one plain color and pattern. You need to have contrast in your builds, not only with the color, but also with the texture. A lot of people just have the same wood planks on every surface. So just the same. I mean, you saw it with those little examples earlier, but if you just use the same wooden planks everywhere, I mean, like, it looks like you're living in an Amazon box, right? If you just stand in this corner, you're living inside a cardboard box, and that's really boring. So use different colors or different textures, put out some logs, make the floor out of a different kind of wood or a wood with a different texture. You can make patterns with these stripped logs, which is really fun. Even just simple stuff like that, and already you're not living in a cardboard box anymore, right? Or if you've got a stone wall, one of the ways you can make them look more natural is by integrating different kinds of blocks. Andesite is a good one because it's really close to the same color as wood, but it's just a little bit different. Or tuff is nice too. It looks sort of like cobblestone if you integrate a few of those in there. Maybe put a cobblestone next to it. Just throw a couple of these in here. It doesn't need to be planned out. You can just put them in randomly. And already it looks like a much more natural wall. And then again, with things like quartz, where it's very much one note, try using some of the other blocks even just the other quartz blocks. Add some pillars, put in some bricks. And you can see that looks much more interesting. If you were to continue this as the wall, you can see that it's got these two layers from the pillars and from the wall behind it. So not only are you creating depth, but you're creating texture variation as well, which is much more interesting to the eye and looks much more finished and professional. But while you're adding the texture, don't forget about color as well. You can see it on our house from earlier, but you should have different colors for the roof, the walls, and if we run inside really quick, the floor is a different color as well. You never want to have all three of those the same color. And I would say don't have any two of them the same color either. Have a different color for each one, because that'll help your eyes distinguish, the different parts of the build. But it also just keeps it from looking like you're in a cardboard box, like I mentioned earlier. And don't be afraid to use small things for texture, like we had in here. We've got these little flower leaves. We've got some stuff in pots. We've got bookshelves, item frames, paintings. All these things create texture and depth within the build, so it keeps it from being too flat and boring. And then the last thing for this tip is to make sure that you stick with some sort of color palette. Like here, I used oak wood. I used different kinds of oak wood, but they're all sort of the same, from the same color palette. I had oak wood and then some spruce for these fence details and for the trapdoors. So if you set yourself a color palette of, 4, 5, or 6 blocks, it'll keep everything tied together. Don't go overboard on the colors or it'll start looking too busy. Just stick to a color palette and then find different textures within that color palette to use throughout your build. So don't be afraid to use strange blocks or weird blocks. A lot of people never stray away from building with just a few basic blocks, and that makes their builds look, basic. If you have a vision in your head, but you can't quite find the way to build it, be willing to experiment with some unorthodox blocks. Try using some chains to hang a staircase, or to hold up a light, like a lantern. Try using trapdoors as floor patterns. You can also use them as shelves, or you can use them to create a picture frame if you surround it. The lantern's in the way here, but I think you get the idea, right? Just, even with more standard blocks, just find more interesting ways to use them. You can also use things like barrels or beehives as wood paneling. Like if you look at these barrels, I have to figure out how to place them all, but You can like stack them up to create a wood paneled wall effect. Or they can be used also in the floor. Just take these off here. If you use them in the floor, it can create certain kinds of effects depending on the way you place them. And you can do the same thing with beehives as well. And you can use beehives similarly to barrels, since they have a wooden look to them. If you got some oak floor, they can create a pattern or like a different texture. You can sprinkle them into your wooden floor or use them solely as a floor. It's really up to you, but it creates more interest in the floor, which is usually just kind of a flat, like a flat one color, one texture surface. So that's a good way to break up the monotony, is by using some of these more interesting blocks. You saw it over here as well with our house, which I'll run back to, which apparently is invaded by bats. But I used these campfires as the top of our patio shade. So sometimes it's hard to figure out what you want to use, but just try messing around with some of these more interesting blocks, maybe some things that you wouldn't think to use. And of course, the internet is always a great place to find inspiration for these things. You can sprinkle in some less used plants. Like I've had builds where I put in the drip leaf plants and the torch flowers, and those can look really cool depending on, the vibe you're going for. So don't be afraid to mess around with these different blocks and use them as in certain ways that you maybe wouldn't think to use them. Landscaping, or terraforming if you prefer, is a huge part of having a successful build. If you don't create an environment that the build fits in, it's not going to end up looking right. It'll look like it's out of place. Now, I'm not saying you have to build an entire cliff behind your house or anything, but varying the ground level and the ground texture is important. We did this a little bit with our house already with the grass and these rocks, but I like to add some other things sometimes, like, you can, especially if you've got some blank space on a wall, you can just add a little pile of hay bales or something like that adds more detail to the world around the house. Maybe we can also go over here. We'll create a little rock hill, or we can add some hills behind the house. But essentially, the idea here is just to add detail not only to your build itself, but to the world around it. So it creates more, going back to, the same texture and depth. That's really the things we've got to hammer home here. But just add more stuff to the environment, not only to the build. A simple landscaping trick that you've already seen me do 1 or 2 times in this video is to make your own trees. The vanilla Minecraft trees are okay. I know some people really hate them. I think they're fine. But just taking a little bit of time to build your own trees really helps to level up your creations, I feel like. You can make them you don't have to have a straight trunk with some leaves on top. Make them, natural and varied. Put some bunches of leaves on the ends of the branches that you create. This also allows you to fit the trees to your style. You'd noticed with this one, I had this oak tree here. If we run back over to our spruce builds from earlier, you'll notice that one was an acacia tree. I used that for contrast. So, making your own trees is something that I really like to do. It just opens up a lot more freedom than placing down a sapling and just hitting it with bone meal. And then besides that, I love to work in dynamic elements such as lighting or water. So maybe we'll just come over here to the side of the house. We can dig out a small little pond. We'll just make it like a natural shape. It doesn't, you don't want those sharp edges because that doesn't look right. We'll dig out the bottom a little bit more here. And then we can just add in some water. And make sure that the water is still, unless you're trying to make a waterfall. Still water looks a lot more better and a lot more finished. And then we can add some height variation around the pond as well. Give it a little bit of a border of some grass right here. And obviously, it would take a while to really build this out. But hopefully you can kind of get what I'm going for here. Maybe if we add some lily pads on top of the water. Then we can put out some flowers as well, just to make it look like there's life around it, because in real life, water is gonna, I don't know why I typed that. Water is gonna be surrounded by life. So make sure to add plants around it. You could put some fish in there if you wanted to, or some frogs or something like that. But just having these more dynamic elements, the lighting and the water, helps to level it up as well. Sometimes I like to use glowberries where I can, because those look really cool in the dark. Of course, it kind of depends on the mood you're going for. Like in this one, our lighting element is the lanterns, and they look really nice. They look kind of rustic and cozy to match our cabin here. And of course, when you're landscaping, make sure to keep all the previous tips in mind. So have the depth, have the color and the texture, and just make sure to just vary it. Don't plan it out too much. I feel like that hurts it and it makes it look unnatural. Just kind of spam out things randomly in a way, and it'll make it look more irregular and more natural. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make when they're building is that they don't think about the lighting, and they just end up placing a bunch of torches all over the place. You've probably seen this plenty of times, and I'm sure you've done it yourself. And torches, while they definitely have their time and place, many builds look so much better if you experiment with your lighting techniques. Glowstone or sea lanterns can be placed under leaves in the corner as fill lights, or we can hang them from chains on the roof, depending on, how far down you want your lighting to come. You can vary the length of the chains. We can also surround them with some trap doors for a different effect. Maybe if we go with these oak ones. And it makes it look sort of like a chandelier, right? You can probably tell by now that I love lanterns. I love the way they look. And I use them pretty much anywhere I can, but the problem is they're more of a rustic vibe. And as you can see with our more modern looking house here, they don't really fit that well. Of course you can still make them work, but for this modern looking house with its white walls, I'd suggest experimenting with some end rods. So maybe we'll just knock out our chandelier here. And you can try, putting them up on the roof, or having them come off the walls. Whatever you want to try. You can even put them in the corners too. Just fill that in. They're kind of like a floor light fixture, You can make them like a light bar, which is fun. Almost just like a RGB pillar type of thing, except it's white. So those look really cool too. So don't just stick with torches, experiment with the different things you've got. We have frog lights. Those are cool. You've got the colored ones. Just pull them out real quick. We've got, green ones or purplish ones. So just don't be afraid to experiment with the different kinds of lighting, because based on what you use, it'll change the mood of the build, but it will also make it look so much more professional. than just putting a bunch of torches everywhere. Another thing that I like to do is to make fireplaces. We'll just knock a couple of these out of the way real quick. Fireplaces, I feel like, are a great source of lighting. Let's just make a little spot for it here. So if we knock these out, grab a campfire, and then we can put some glass around it. I think campfires are a great lighting source because not only do they give you that dynamic lighting from the movement of the flames, but they make it just look a lot more like a house. Like a lot of houses have fires. So I love fireplaces. And they're an easy way to add more ambiance to a house. And of course, if you knock out the roof, you can let the smoke go out in a chimney. So just experiment with all these different kinds of lighting based on the mood you're trying to create. Think about, the color of the lights, the texture, where you can place them. And this is one of the best ways I've found to really just level up your builds, because not only does it let you see the rest of the build, obviously, but finding the right lighting for the build really helps set the tone, set the mood, and make it look much more finished and professional. And that's it. These 10 simple tips can be applied to any build, large or small. If you start integrating them into your projects, I guarantee your builds will start looking much more professional. If you guys have any questions or ideas for future videos, just drop them in the comments below and I'll be happy to help. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful to you. If it was, consider subscribing so you don't miss future tutorials. Like the video and share it with your friends so they can get better at builds too. As always, stay safe, enjoy life, and I'll see you guys next time.